welcome, welcome, welcome to Health Issues. I'm your host, Chris Sylvain, and I am so thoroughly excited about today's show. And obviously, we're looking at history, and the history in our country, but literally it extends throughout the world. But we're looking at the history of the slave trade, and we have an awesome researcher, PhD, University of New Orleans, right here in New Orleans, Louisiana, UNO, Dr. Andrea Mosterman. How are you, Doctor?
Thank you. I'm good. Thank you for having me.
We're excited to have you, and I know we've been working on this, so we're really, really happy to have you. And your area, you've been researching this Atlantic slave trade, pre-colonial area, and looking at Dutch ships and the Dutch. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, I'm an early Americanist and an Atlanticist, and I focused on the Atlantic slave trade in the Dutch Atlantic world and in early America, colonial North America. So that would be the 13 colonies. So I've looked at predominantly early New York and slavery and slave exchanges in early New York. Recently I've started working also on a slave ship, as you mentioned, the reconstruction of a slave ship in the Dutch Atlantic. And so those are my research focuses. Teaching I expand into the 20th century and the African diaspora, but that's what I really focus on in my research. Plus the representation of slavery. So that's another aspect that I've been working on.
In the movies?
In movies and beyond, yes. So if I can, the reason why I got to studying all of what I study right now is really growing up in the Netherlands, where I'm from, and not being exposed to the history of slavery of the Dutch. And so the Netherlands had colonies in Curaçao, Aruba, Suriname, and greatly benefiting from slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And so I never really was taught those things until I became older and started to research that history myself. And that has really opened up for me the interest in studying slavery and the slave trade, because we still know so little about that. In my case, that interest came from the Dutch and the Dutch Atlantic, but you can see the same thing in North America. And so as part of my research early on, I actually studied the representation of slavery at the River Road plantations in Louisiana, because that is something that is not really paid attention to. At least when I was doing that research, it wasn't paid attention to. And as you mentioned, I've also looked at movies. That was more so in my teaching, that I taught a class on the representation of slavery in Hollywood movies. But to be able to really address those issues, to say, well, we need to talk about this, we need to, in literature, in movies, in museums, we need to pay more attention to the history of slavery and the slave trade. We also need to know that history. And so that's where I went back to the 17th century to actually study that history, so that we know what to talk about and what to share with the general public. So that's basically full circle, going back to the 17th century to be able to incorporate that to share with the larger public.
Awesome. I'm excited. Bring us back into the 17th century first, and then we can go up to the movies. We were talking a minute earlier, if we can kind of delve right back in there, the mental construct to carry this enterprise on, dealing with actual human beings. Back then, it was, and still to this day, but back then it was cloaked in religiosity, in a sense. If you can kind of share with us about that some.
Yeah, well, as we discussed earlier, there's in the 17th century and before that, really the understanding of anything that was happening to people was very much explained in religious terms. And so if there was an epidemic of some sort, then that was explained as that must be God's punishment. So people also understood their their success and expansion and economic success and the success in conquest and colonization in terms of that must be God granting them these things. And so that also then played a role in the enslavement or the transportation of enslaved people and the using of these enslaved people in the Americas, because in large part there was this on the one hand, they were seen as savages. Therefore, they could be used by Christians to enslave them, to use their labor for whatever purposes they wanted. On the other hand, so that it's a complex issue. On the other hand, there were those people who argued that as long as you Christianize these slaves, then you are actually doing them something good. You're actually giving them something. And there's this Dutch Reformed Church minister in the 1740s in the Netherlands. He was actually himself a slave previously from what today would be Ghana, Elmina. He was a slave of a Dutch merchant there. He was brought to the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands he got his freedom and got a PhD at the University of Leiden in theology. And he wrote his dissertation about this issue, and in part, one of the things he argued was that the enslavement of people was justified if they were becoming Christians, because what he said that even the enslavement of them physically was justified because we free them spiritually, as long as they get that spiritual freedom through Christianization. So on many different levels, we see that religion plays a significant role. Of course, there's the whole story, the biblical stories that are used to enslave people, the sons of Ham, the Gibeonites. So these various stories in the Bible that stated that there were people in the world who were cursed by God. And oftentimes then Europeans would say, well, those were Africans, and therefore it's okay to enslave Africans because that is really what their fate in this world should be, to serve us for whatever reasons. So on so many levels, religion played an important role in slavery and the slave trade, and in understanding and justifying that it was a very important part of it. Yes, absolutely.
Mixed with the economics of it.
Well, so in my opinion, economics was the foundation of it. I mean, I think that religion was an important part of explaining certain aspects of it or justifying, but really what I believe is that at the foundation is the economics of it, that money talks in some ways, that if you can make money off of whatever it is, then you will find your ways to justify that. And I think that was the case with slavery as well, and the slave trade. Yeah,
that's a wonderful point, because if it was purely religious, suppose it was the reverse, then people would say, well, I need to be a slave because if that's what God wants. But it's funny that religion seems to follow money so many times.
Oh, absolutely.
Not the opposite way around.
Yeah,
if people can make money, it becomes godly real quick.
Yeah.
Not all religion, but
yeah.
The Atlantic slave trade of Africans, some of the differences, like you mentioned, is a complex area, but how could that particular slave trade, was it different?
Different from
other slavery had been going on since early man, up until this day, this present day human slavery. But.
Yeah. I think there are different aspects to this. But for one, what was really important was just the numbers of it. I mean, the estimates are that it was about 12 million people who were transported across the Atlantic in the transatlantic slave trade. And that is the people who actually would be accounted for on the ships. But even before these people are boarding the ships to be transported across the Atlantic, people already died on the African continent as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. So it's amazing numbers in a relatively brief period. If you look at 12 million people over a 300-400 time period, And then on top of that, of course, the racial aspect of it, that over time that became such an important part of it, that idea that Africans, in the case of North America, and it's different everywhere, but in the case of North America, at some point you see that being African, having a darker skin color almost becomes synonymous with being a slave, whereas being white becomes synonymous with freedom. And so that was something that is very particular to that transatlantic slave trade, to that extent, but especially the fact that it was so massive, and that people really were dehumanized. They really became chattel, at least in many cases, not everywhere. And we talked about this earlier, that slavery is so complex. It's so different in different places in the Americas. But we do see that the majority of people who ended up enslaved in the Americas were treated as chattel and dehumanized. And that's a very important aspect of it that you don't always see in other forms of slavery in other parts of the world.
Define that word, chattel.
So really being treated as part of the livestock, I guess, being what you are is not anything more or less than a laborer, and not a laborer as in a human being, but really like a mule, or like you are part of the workforce, but that's the only significance to you. Like that's all that you are considered, at least in that society. Obviously, that's not what happened to these people, right, but that is how they were perceived. Yeah. So
even as a free person, a person may be so-called free, but it doesn't actually increase their status in the eyes of people, because they're still chattel. They just may not be a slave at that particular time, but they may own property or whatever, but it's not as if they can ever integrate fully into...
You mean free Africans?
Yeah.
In the Americas?
Yeah.
They would have been, like I said, there are a lot of different versions of slavery in the Americas, and different... even at times it changed. So let me give you an example. In New York, what today is New York, in the 17th century, when it was still a Dutch colony called New Amsterdam, the city of New Amsterdam in the colony of New Netherland, the slaves there were able to make wages, own property. They used the court system. They used it successfully even against white settlers, free white settlers. They were able to marry in the Dutch Reformed Church. They had their children baptized in the Dutch Reformed Church.
Interracial?
There are also interracial relationships and baptisms and marriages and baptisms of children that are of mixed descent. They were still slaves, although some of them in 1644 were able to get half freedom, so that it was a conditional form of freedom. That was different from what we oftentimes think of when we think of slavery in the antebellum South or in 18th century Saint-Domingue. I mean, it differed so much per place and time. Even in New York, that early period, these were possibilities for enslaved people. But toward the latter part of the 17th century and the early 18th century, that changed. They started to impose slave codes. Enslaved people could no longer use the court systems they were able to do before. They were no longer able to make wages. In fact, they weren't even allowed at some point to congregate with more than 5 people because of a slave rebellion in New York City in the 1710s. So these things changed over time, and you see that in other parts as well. So there are many different forms of slavery throughout the Americas, not just that plantation slavery. And so the idea of chattel slavery was an important aspect of slavery in the Americas, but it wasn't the only form. Not all enslaved people were seen as chattel, but it's the predominant aspect of it. Yeah.
Was it a big difference between Southern slavery and Northern slavery, or?
It was in some ways. Once again, economics, I think, are at the core of that, because the racism wasn't any different.
Really?
But, but what you see is that in New York, slaves would work oftentimes on farms, in the home, domestics. They would work in the docks. Oftentimes, one slaveholder would have just a few people in bondage, whereas, of course, in the southern parts, you see more the plantation economy, where they had these various cash crops. At first, rice and tobacco, later on, of course, cotton, in the Caribbean, sugar. So there you had the larger plantations, and that changed the labor and the circumstances for enslaved people in those areas. But I think that one of the things you see everywhere is that the same debates over slavery and race existing, whether you're in New England, New York, New Jersey, or South Carolina or Georgia. So, yeah.
The racism northern racism wasn't different than southern racism.
No, and what people, I don't think so, and what people oftentimes tend to forget is that it wasn't until 1827 that New York actually abolished slavery. So that's only a little under 40 years that it was abolished in the South. Now, of course, in New York, this was a process, and the state itself abolished it, whereas in the South, of course, people were not necessarily, those people in control were not happy with the abolition of slavery. But it's not such a long time period. And the same in places like New Jersey, Pennsylvania. So even though slavery was abolished in those areas before the Civil War, it existed in many parts up until the early 19th century. And even after the abolition in those areas, it's not as if that meant that African Americans were all of a sudden treated equally. So, for example, in the case of New York, you see that after the abolition of slavery, I've seen documents where refer to an African American, in certain documents it will say slave, and then it's crossed out saying servant, because there's still that it's still so much a part of society. Part of the abolition in New York in 1799, they started a gradual emancipation, so saying that people will be freed after they finish, people who are born after 1799 will get their freedom after they finish a set number of years of work. And so anyone born after 1799, once they, I believe it was 25 and 27, 25 for women, 25 for men, once they reach that age, they will get their freedom. So that was a way to gradually abolish it. But as part of that Emancipation Act, they also said that because of that, any slaveholder who had a slave born after 1799 could actually give up that slave to the overseers of the poor. So that meant that a child born after 1799, the master could say, I don't want to feed you for all those years, and then when you reach 25, you're going to get your freedom. So I'm going to give you up to the overseers of the poor. Those children had to stay with their mother for 1 year. After that, they were given away to the overseers of the poor. Most of those children would end up in orphanages, and many of them would die. That is a part of the history that shows that that abolition of slavery in those parts, it wasn't as if that meant that everything was going to be great. There's this whole generation of enslaved children in New York that kind of just were, and the records are there, were name after name, and some women their names appear there several times. They have a child, a couple of years later, they have another child, and those children are giving up, and they never hear from them again. We don't know what happened with those children. And that's in New York in the early 19th century. So it's everywhere. It's different, and the economics are different, and that's why in some of these northeastern parts, actual slavery was not as beneficial to have it locally, but they were still benefiting from slavery in the South. So the connections were very much there, far beyond that. And the racism very much existed still. Yes, absolutely.
So that theological, philosophical construct that made it okay never really changed, and it stayed consistent or whatever.
Yeah, you do see that there's more, especially in the early 19th century, when you see the Second Great Awakening. There's these religious influences where it becomes the argument that all people are equal before God becomes more influential, and you see that really influencing also the abolitionist movement, for example. So we do see that those things change slowly but surely, but they're gradual changes, and you know, that's a part of society. It's also easier to make those arguments if you don't benefit from slavery, whereas if you're benefiting from it, you would be less likely maybe to be open to those arguments.
Wow, very, very interesting. Take us back again into the 17th century, I guess the life of the slave. And like you said, it's very different depending upon economics. So it's varied, but I guess the dominant areas, I guess most were in the South. Am I correct? Most of the slaves?
Well, in the 17th century, you actually see that it's, there's the Chesapeake, so you had the Virginia and Maryland colonies. The Carolinas are not until the latter part of the 17th century that they were founded, and Georgia actually not until the 1720s. So, and at the foundation of Georgia, slavery actually was not allowed. That was part of its foundation. Really? They changed that. Yeah, they changed it later on because the settlers there were saw people in the Carolinas doing really well, in part because of slavery, and they wanted that themselves as well. But the founding of Georgia actually argued that there was no slavery to be allowed there. In New Amsterdam, so New York City, the enslaved population actually made up a third of the population, about a third of the population in the 1630s. So we actually see that in that area, there was a lot of use of slave labor, whereas in Maryland and Virginia, it was much less so, in large part because they were benefiting more from indentured servants who were shipped over from England. So it's not until the latter part of the 17th century that you see that slavery becomes more predominant, becomes more racialized, and becomes more beneficial for people in the American colonies, and that's where you see it really spreading also in the Carolinas and then eventually in Georgia. So it's in the 17th century, it exists everywhere, but it's still really muddy. It's not codified in law in many places, so there are no clear laws of what is a slave, what does a slave, what are slaves' rights. And what we see is that enslaved Africans were able to use that to kind of gain more freedoms, more opportunities. So when I gave the examples of the slaves in New Amsterdam, for example, there were no laws that said you are allowed to use the courts, you are allowed to own property. That wasn't written anywhere. But the absence of it allowed them to take those rights. Yeah. So slaves in that period, we see similar things actually also happening in the Chesapeake area, that enslaved Africans in those areas were able to kind of, get certain things working for them within the system. But that all changes in the latter part of the 17th and early 18th century as it becomes more oppressive, more racialized. The whole dynamics of it change.
The Puritans and their relationship with slavery, and I guess the American Revolution, and we heard about Thomas Jefferson and slaves, and all of the founding fathers pretty much had slaves. So, any thoughts on that?
Well, what is fascinating is that actually the first colony to codify slavery into law was Massachusetts. That was in the 1630s. So it's fascinating when you think about it that they were the first ones to do so. They weren't, however, really relying on the labor of enslaved people. Slavery existed, and people had slaves, but it wasn't. There was no cash crop that required really the labor of a lot of people in plantation settings. So we don't really see slavery becoming huge there in that sense, but there are actually a lot of connections between New England families and families in the Caribbean, or people who lived in New England who had plantations in the Caribbean. There's an amazing museum today just north of Boston of the royal family who had slaves in Massachusetts, but they also had close connections with plantations in the Caribbean. So they actually, even though they didn't have hundreds of slaves in New England, they actually were making a lot of money off of slave labor in the Caribbean.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's not as if their religiosity kept them from having slaves. In fact, you know, it could be argued that it could maybe be the reverse even to some extent.
So sounds good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting thing. The term slavery. In fact, let's flip this. Before we close, we have a couple of more minutes. This is so interesting. Slavery in the movies, how is it different from the true, the Django Unchained or whatever, than the reality of it?
Yeah, well, it's very different, of course. It's very difficult for people to watch the realities of slavery, right? And so I think that is actually something that the movie 12 Years a Slave has shown us a more realistic version of what slavery was like. But it's also a very difficult movie to watch. I mean, it's just, you're really confronted with the horrors of slavery that for a lot of people, when you go to the movies, you don't want to watch those things. You don't want to be uncomfortable that way and be really confronted with the horrors of that part of your history. And so what we see is that for a long time it has been, well, some people might say sugar-coated. I mean, there's of course the Gone with the Wind, Shirley Temple. There's a lot of different movies where slavery was shown as kind of this benevolent system, what people oftentimes, are led to believe. And Django Unchained really took the other part of the spectrum, of course, like taking it into an extreme version of the horrors of slavery, and 12 Years a Slave is a more realistic version of it.
Well, hey, Dr. Mosterman, I cannot thank you enough. We have to study our history. What's taught in history classes may not be what you need to know. You need to find the true history, know who you are, know who we are, and stay strong. Thank you.